much, Martina. Thank you, everyone. Carolina is having some internet problems, so I'm gonna start sharing the discussion, and perhaps I can invite all of you to turn on your cameras and also the attendees to start typing their questions if you do have questions, or to raise your hands if you want to ask a question or to contribute to this discussion. And perhaps as a way to just start, one of the questions that I've had while I was listening to you, and more generally during the past year, has to do with the role of critique. That's a question that kind of was present in all of your short interventions, right? The problem of critique when we are faced with the discourse and with the situation that kind of insists so much on the vulnerabilization of everyone and on the need of protecting everyone, of protecting everyone from each other, even from our neighborhood. What's the space for? Do we still have a space for a critical activity that goes beyond the mere critique to a government who is not able to protect their citizens enough? What forms of critical activity do you see possible in this context, from the smallest to the broadest ones?
Well, maybe I can say something from my own perspective, and just as a way of launching the discussion. The obviously strong sense of critique that you're mentioning, I would relate to the possibility, indeed the need, to ask what is actually happening, rather than trying to find who is responsible for, right? So it is about the nature of the event that is unfolding. And I think in a necessarily incomplete way, we've all had a go at it. I mean, we've all tried to address this question in one way or another. And I mean, maybe I can just pick up on two threads that I think have run through all of the various interventions. One was the thread of forms of life, because this is what we're talking about, so in relation to territories, processes of territorialization and re-territorialization, and the way in which those processes have been accentuated, emphasized, and used also politically during the pandemic crisis. But interestingly, perhaps, another thread that has been running through it, and one that I was trying to raise in the beginning, is, well, I didn't actually raise it as a possible connection, but I would like to raise the possible connection between territory on the one hand and terra, or the earth on the other. So the connection between this pandemic as providing a point of articulation, but of course one that is one of crisis and tension between territory and the earth. Now, I think critique then has a way of trying to leave a mark and trying to articulate problems through a specific moment, but in relation to a certain history, certain geography, certain forms of life. And of course, this discussion can be sort of expanded in different kinds of in different directions and in different ways. I don't want to monopolize the discussion, but maybe just as a way of beginning to answer your question.
If I can jump here, I think there's also the question you mentioned before of the exacerbation of the processes. So clearly that affected, first and foremost, the conditions of possibility of critique, because on the one hand, the pandemic exposed inequalities in a way that for many of us were literally intolerable. But on the other, because of the various mechanisms of biopolitical control, for which the pandemic has been, we haven't said it yet, I mean, that's the ABC, but let's remember the ABC, that's an extraordinary laboratory for biopolitical techniques of control. We all going around with our, I mean, different countries at different levels of biopolitical control, but the laboratory, the experience has happened, and we don't know yet what governments will do with that know-how in how to control not simply people, but entire population. Personally, I'm scared, and I think that we need even more critique for that than before. But on the other hand, paradoxically, perhaps is another paradox we have seen. I mean, in the US, for instance, the massive critique triggered by Black Lives Matter, the pandemic has managed to do to make the color line visible even for all of those who had never seen it before. I mean, the moment when all the rich people can get out of New York City in their wealthy second or third house, and literally all the people in the street who keep life going are Black, you have to see it. I mean, there's no way you can avoid seeing it. So on one hand, I think, I don't know what's going to happen. It's an open question. There is this incredible laboratory for biopolitical technique of control that has happened, and we don't know how it will be used. But on the other hand, there is also the exacerbation of inequalities and injustices which call for more critique. I mean, if I can add another question to the question, one question I have for both Maurice and Martina is, Maurice, you spoke about this slightly paradoxical condition that at the moment when the borders are more imaginary, right? Because the virus doesn't respect the border, obviously. Not only does it respect the border between territories, but not even those between species, which is what I was trying to say. We insist even more on this obsessive control of border. Is paradox the right concept here? I mean, it's really an open question. Is it a paradox, or is it the other side of the coin, that as we lose more and more control, we exacerbate the sort of obsessive physical control on the few places where we can exercise it, and to begin with on the sovereign borders. I really don't know how to frame this. It's an open question, but I wonder whether paradox is the right concept, and if it is, where is it leading us?
Thank you, Chiara. I don't know if the other, so if Martina, I see you have your hands up, but also just to ask also Maurice if there's an immediate comment to Chiara's question before we move to Martina's question, comment. No, okay, yes, please, Martina.
I think Martina, yeah, I can get
okay.
Speak afterwards. Yeah.
Oh, well, I don't mind. Yeah, no, just a comment that in part also Chiara addressed, so that in my opinion, this big question that Daniele raised of critique, that is the question of the moment, I agree. I think that the lockdown, the multiple lockdowns have also been moment of proliferation of struggles that we should look at. So the Black Lives Matter in the UK and in the US have definitely shifted the debates and foregrounded what I just named as this misleading opposition between freedom of movement and equal access to health and to healthcare. And while Daniele was asking the question, what came to my mind is the way in which the feminist group Non Una Di Meno and Ni Una Menos in Argentina framed the terms of the debate during the pandemic, arguing that freedom of movement should be at the core of our debate at the moment, precisely because of the links between social reproduction, freedom of movement, and border violence, so that we cannot really disjoin one from the other. And the differential restrictions to mobility has also a clear impact on these two other aspects: border violence on the one hand and social reproduction on the other. So I think that being able to disrupt what is presented as a binary opposition between mobility on the one hand and struggle for social justice and for health should be at the core of the way in which we can rethink critique, because the pandemic in the end is also a moment, a great opportunity for rethinking and for starting struggle for social justice in relation to health, without disjoining from these other claims about freedom of movement. So refusing the terms in which the debate has been framed.
Yes, maybe just to add to that, and I agree that, paradox is probably not the correct term here, right? I think, what we see, or what I wanted to express, is that we see this quite sort of incredible proliferation of boundaries and borders. And as you said, explosion of controls, right? These sort of more visible or more invisible forms of control. And I'm also very scared, right, about what this might mean for the future. I think, but it is coupled with this really strong clinging to a sort of nationalist imaginary of the border as a clear territorial line, right? And so we see how these things, work in tandem in a way. And I think it's the worst of both worlds in a way, being able to coexist in a way, right? And then I think also, with Martina, I've written another paper where we even wonder what is the role of critique when, it is not just about producing more evidence about something that is already known, right? So when we think about migrant atrocities in the Mediterranean, we all know it now for such a long time, right? So is a critique just highlighting that this is still happening, or do we need to find something else that is, for Freud ways, it cuts more in a way, right? What is what he refers to as creating an active intolerable, right? How can we generate a sort of sense of intolerability and, and break the sort of acceptability of borders and the imaginary of borders? And I hear, I think you've already said it, that there are these different sort of struggles that we have to look to, because I think there's not that much else otherwise, right? And I think, with Foucault again, I think, what is needed as always is this sort of hyper but pessimistic form of activism. So.
Thank you, Maurice. I would like also to ask a question in relation to especially Miguel's and Chiara's presentation at the beginning. Miguel, I don't know if you want to. Okay, so I was particularly interested as well in the overlaps between your presentation, especially towards the end, Miguel, when you're talking about precarious forms of lives, but really expanding the notion as well, as I understanding, to a more kind of ecological, environmental approach to the correlation or even radical interdependence between forms of lives, but not only. And also, I think Chiara did touch upon that as well, especially, and I think here very critically talking about ontologies and epistemologies and how Western ontologies have been based, I think here, Chiara, I will be quoting you, on mainly bio-ontologies. And I wanted to ask you both a question in relation to this, because this radical separatedness, in a way in which we found ourselves in the last 16 months, did also bring, one could argue, an acute sense of precisely those radical connectivities, which might be paradoxical. Chiara, I don't know exactly if it's the right term, but just like also how these polarities kind of are brought together in this experience. And as we go through this process, some colleagues have been talking about also something that sounds to me quite interesting, that is not only about reflecting upon the fact that we lost or we are not any longer socializing in a kind of a more sort of intuitive way, which would be like being together in a room, etc., as this conversation would be taking place if it were prior to this experience. But also, on the other hand, and this is, I'm quoting a colleague and curator in theories, Doreen Mende, what she calls rehearsing remote proximity. Through these means, and not only through online means, also through other means. There's, for instance, colleagues in Chile talking about Patricia Dominguez, who is also going to participate in this project, talking about technologies of the self, which actually resonates very much with Foucauldian ideas as well, but through a different angle. So my question is, if there's anything to also be taken away from this experience in terms of the ways in which we think of sociability, also, I think in this more ecological, more environmental understanding that doesn't only involve social as in human approach, but if we are also to consider other modalities and tools that emerged from his experience that we could take also with us into a post-pandemic condition. I would like to hear Chiara and Miguel, if that's okay.
Sure, yes, thank you so much for your question. I think it helped me clarify what I was trying to say. Actually, I think in a sentence you've put it even much better than I did. I think you said something like the radical separation we lived made it even more clear how in fact we are so entangled with one another, not only with other human beings, but also with other life forms and species. And I would even push the boundary further and how we are entangled even with the forms of animacies that question the life versus non-life divide. Now, I try to convey that with the notion of trans-individuality and the trans-individual philosophy being something I've been working on now for a while, because it seemed to me that the more we tried to isolate each other, the more we realized how, in fact, that's not possible. And the moment when you manage, or at least you think you manage to have completely isolated yourself, you have lost what is worth living for, right? Certainly this holds for the relationship and very obviously the relationship between different human beings, the relation between different races and racial regimes, social reproduction work, but also with the more, what is called the more than human, and also what escape our humanist mind frame, which always tends to privilege life forms that resemble ours and being not attuned to those who don't. And I think, well, first of all, because the COVID-19 was generated by, is a disease that comes to us from other animals, at least we have to take into consideration that. But then how about the air that we breathe or the food that we eat? We all had this experience during the pandemic of how much the air we breathe may carry virus, which by itself question the life, non-life divide. They may be a source of sicknesses. So you put it very nicely. I completely agree. And I think this is, in my view, is just the beginning. The problem is that on the one hand, I mean, Maurice, I don't know whether paradox is the right word. I mean, my question was really authentic. I don't know whether paradox is the right term, but there's clearly this tension between, on the one hand, the pandemic has exposed, I call this somatic communism, how much we are depending on one another, okay, with a provocative term. But on the other, there's all these boundaries that are being erected even more strongly and even more obsessive than before. Okay, spoke too much.
That's great, thank you.
Thank you, Chiara, and Karenina, for your wonderful question. If I may just add something, it's perhaps a different way of saying this, the same thing, or again, trying to put my finger on the same paradox that we have, and we are constantly realizing the need for, and indeed the facticity of what we could call transborder sociability. And the borders are the borders that Martina and Maurice were talking about, but they're also the borders that Chiara was talking about, that separate, that fragment constantly what is in effect a continuum into separate categories, over which, of course, there is one ruler, which is the human. So there is a human construction and an anthropocentric world at the heart of which, by definition, we find ourselves, and that proceed through series of exclusions, right? So through a series of negations, as if to isolate something like a specificity of the human, but this specificity is always an operation of power, right? It is always a way of erecting the human over and beyond other species, but not just the human in general, a certain kind of human. So mostly the European modern human. And so indeed, I think what we have witnessed sort of limits of this, and including through specific struggles, like Black Lives Matter, for example, we have witnessed it, I think, also deep within ourselves. But as to whether this will translate into anything concrete and more specific, I have serious doubts, because the obstacles and the powers and all that we are hearing about is when we go back to the previous life, right? When we go back to the normal life. So this episode is considered as a kind of abnormality, even though that all the signs are there to show that it is exactly the opposite, right? It is a revealer of something that is going to be played time and again, perhaps differently, but is going to be our life. And if I may perhaps try to connect this point back to the sense of critique that Daniele was mentioning at the beginning, one other thing, and it's again an issue that I think runs through everything that we have said. I've been quite struck by the place, the very problematic and perhaps again paradoxical place of science in this whole period. And on the one hand, we had the science sort of deniers, so often sort of conspiracy theorists with this idea that science was this tool that was manipulated by power. And then we have, so which is a kind of perhaps dark and reductive view of the way in which science operates, but one could nonetheless push that in a different kind of direction, which would be the direction of the connection between science, forms of rationality, and forms of power, in this instance, biopower. So we have that on the one hand, and on the other, we have this absolute faith in science, as if science were going to be, again, the savior, as if there was this salvation in science, and that took the form of the vaccine, and that's what's going to enable us to go back to our previous life. And in between those, I'm struck by the vacuum of sort of political reflection and the way in which political power situates itself in relation to science, because science will never tell us what to do or how to act. And I feel that on the one hand, there is this view that science is manipulating us like puppets. And on the other hand, there is this view that science is there to save us and lead the way. And I think it is neither. So our view of science is also largely a sort of very skewed one that could be made much more useful and complicated by going in the direction of things that Chiara was talking about, for example, in relation to Simondon, in relation to the possibility of rethinking this continuum and the place of the human within it. All right.
Absolutely. Thank you so much to both of you. I know we are now 2 minutes past the hour, 30 minutes past the hour, but I would take the liberty of asking another question to Maurice and also Martina, in very much picking up on this idea that Miguel just mentioned in terms of the tensions, let's say, at the political level as well, when it comes to arguments that we see playing out, say, in the traditional or the far right movements, especially protests we saw happening throughout against the restrictions, against the lockdown, and how these movements are kind of galvanizing support as well, drawing on also COVID-19 deniers. And it's interesting because the discussion around borders, I think, Martina and Maurice, discussions about borders and freedom of movement also in a way kind of chimed in a strange manner, because I would say that although in terms of terminology, in terms of discourse, they seem to be very kind of seem to resonate, but actually we know that these claims and also these articulations, philosophical and also in terms of activist movement, these claims around the freedom of speech as well, movement of choice and freedom of movement have been claimed from the left, the culture very much situated in the left. And now we have this apparent, I would say, seeming kind of conflation between these two discourses at times. And I wonder if you could articulate, could explore a bit what would be, if the direction is to claim these terms and try to actualize them so that they mean exactly what the claims are in the left, or if we are to move as well to other modes of discourse and claims.
Martina, maybe I can just say a few words and then you continue. Thanks for the question. I think, so because, we also touched upon Black Lives Matter and so on in the US, I think, one of the main problems is that, even these sort of alternative imaginaries that have been developed, through certain struggles, quite often fail to translate to a larger transversus or transnational imaginary, right? So I think even the Black Lives Matter movement is quite US-centric in many ways, right? It has rarely been connected to, the issue of migration in the first place, the abolition of ICE, right? When we talk about the abolition of the police, we very rarely talk about the abolition of immigration controls, right? So like, how can we use some of the momentum that has been developed to move it to the issue of the border? And I think here, what we mentioned before, the role of critique and to develop alternative imaginaries is really crucial, but it is also very difficult because I do not really see that there is the momentum or there is not a dynamism that can translate these different struggles into a movement also that problematizes borders and deproblematizes movement, right? Human movement. Because I mean, the coronavirus and the pandemic has given so much sort of ammunition to those who think that unauthorized forms of human movement, that's the problem, right? This is, it's an ammunition to battle these sorts of movements that are not authorized by the state, right? And so when we have all the really significant discussions about sort of abolition, prison abolition, police abolition in the US and so on, I still quite often do not see firstly how it's translated to the European context in the first place, but then I also do not see how it's translated in terms of, you know, a sort of global imaginary or a sort of abolitionist vista, right, which goes beyond the national imaginary. And so for me, you know, the main problem is really to wonder how can we de-problematize movement and problematize movement control, right? I'm not sure I answered your question, but, you know, I hand over to Martina to do that.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, I very much agree. For me, well, is this kind of surprising from certain point of view response of the so-called left wing around borders. I'm thinking about here this idea of like zero COVID position in the UK, right? Part of the Labour Party that is advocating for more borders, more national frontiers, and more lockdown as a response to infection. Is quite telling of the fact that in the end, probably this border imaginary, as Maurice called it, is so much rooted, right? So that in the end, you said, Carolina, that there is this, when this has been always keywords from the left, but actually these moments is, I mean, unveils that actually the institution of borders is very much rooted in at the level of our mindset. So it's the very critique of the fact that borders might help in protecting the most vulnerable. That is not accepted. And if someone can tell me one single way, which in this very moment, there are borders that are useful for protecting the most vulnerable, right? And instead of, and without multiplying differences and, inequalities, this is quite interesting. So this idea that through borders, in the end, we can reach some form of generalized protection that is misleading. Regarding abolitionism, yeah, I also agree with Maurice in terms of difficulties in translating from one context to another. Let's say that I think that abolitionism as a general discourse, in my opinion, might be helpful precisely for as a method, as a gauge for stepping out of this migration-focused perspective on borders, and to look at what if we shift attention towards how the borders impact on not only on migrants but also on other marginalized subject and vulnerable subject, and to trace this racialized, interlocking racialization, as Angela Davis called it. So in this sense, I think that has been one of the good outputs of the pandemic, if we can use as a method and not only as a grounded experience. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much to both of you. I just have two questions. Sorry, I can hear my echo, but I hope you can hear me well. I have two questions now here in the Q&A box. Nikki Clements, do you want to ask the question by unmuting your microphone? Else I can always read it from the Q&A box. So Nikki says, thank you all for a superb set of reflections. Border violence and policing was so clearly delineated in the panel, yet thinking from the perspective of the ecological crisis, there is also the need to extend increased care to people in places that have been the most exploited, including strategically obscured by the violators. So I wonder how we can think about the dynamics of protection and preservation when borders have been weaponized against the most vulnerable. I don't know if any of you want to address this question, Nikki's question.
Maybe I can give it a try, also connecting to what Maurice and Martina said before, and perhaps trying to end with a slightly more positive note. So it's true that different struggles don't easily translate, and that the problem of borders is obviously there, but I think there's also something, it may be too early to say, that has been happening in terms of transnational connection between different movements. I know most, for instance, in terms of the feminist movement, but you can see how, clearly the struggles of Ni Una Menos in Argentina could not translate immediately for those in the US, but the reverberation between the two movements, the connection between the feminist part of Black Lives Matters and all the movements, the feminist movements in Latin America, which were also clearly anti-colonial and linked to indigenous struggles, it's huge. Like, so what the pandemic has also enabled is to develop forms of connection. We are one very tiny, small example of this form of connection between the networks of struggles. Thinking, for example, of Victoria Gago, Feminist Transnational book, which really chart the way in which the feminist movement is now ready to go back to normal. I mean, we are very, very angry. I mean, certain things are intolerable. It's intolerable that homes are only safe for some people and not for others. So maybe from the point of view of politics that Miguel was mentioning, from the point of view of politics understood as formal politics, these networks are not visible, but in terms of grassroots politics, they're there, and they're not going to give up that easily.
Thank you, Chiara. What I would do now is to read another question we have also in the Q&A box.
Carolina, I want to jump in at some point if possible.
Sure. Do you want to do it now?
No, I think maybe the question first, and then I can make a comment. It's more of a comment.
Okay, fantastic. So from Alexis Bedola, I don't know if Alexis is here and wants to ask the question directly. It's just by unmuting your microphone, Alexis. Okay, else I can also read. I wonder what the panelists make of the appeals to the rhetoric of the global, in inverted commas, as point of contrast to the national, especially as a discursive appeal to global health, for instance, is deployed in a strategical fashion to the politicized capitalist and colonial practices of health interventions, for example, in problems regarding vaccines or borders. Thanks. So, well, again, it touches upon most of the topics that all of you refer to. So I don't know who wants to address this question. No, Maurice, you are not moving, but I thought you could give it a go. What do you think?
Well, I don't really have a direct answer now. I think, what Chiara said earlier is that, we do not quite yet know how this will play out, and I think, in terms of biopolitics of control, we will see a range of new sort of strategies, tactics, technologies, infrastructures that are currently developing in a way, right? And I think, so like, the idea of global health will facilitate that, right? And I think, the understanding that we will have more borders that are also health-proofed in a way, right, will, I think, multiply. So we are already talking about immunity passports, right? We will have immunitary borders in many ways, right? And Esposito and so on have also already gestured to that. But I think it could obviously become a routine practice in a not so distant future, right? Where we see how under the realm of global health, whatever that really means, right? It's a very particular kind of health for a particular group of privileged people so that they can still move very rapidly across space and time. I think this will, engender novel forms of sort of mobility control, both in terms of facilitating movement and the speed of particular movements, and obviously decelerating, slowing down, deterring other kinds of movement, right? That will then, you know, find other sort of ever more precarious ways. So I think, you know, this is basically just what came to my mind.
Thank you, Maurice. So I'll hand over now to Federico.
Oh, thanks, Carolina. I was having trouble with my audio, so I was trying to jump in, but no one, there was a problem. So now, I think what I want to say is more of a sort of an idea. The interventions and the discussion comes together in a way, and I think it's quite interesting what Chiara said at the beginning, the idea that we cannot be healthy or sick on our own. We are somehow in this infra-dependent of each other in a way. On the other hand, like going back to what Miguel said, for example, the pandemic really magnifies the divisions and the hierarchies that already exist, or the border mechanisms that Martina was talking about. And I was thinking about how to connect these two ideas. On the one hand, that, you know, we are infra-dependent, and, you know, being sick means being in an interaction with others, and also they were so divided in a way. And it seems to me that where the discussion is leading is that the way that these two things connect is precisely the border, right? As Maurice said, we should look what's going on at the borders, because it seems to me that, you know, there's no a priori border. Borders where the divisions are made, right? There's a sort of symbolical, archetypical partage or division that the border constitutes. So on the one hand, we are interconnected and we know this, but on the other, it seems that we're constantly working on creating these borders. So I don't know, just as a means to connect this and to see what you think about it.
Perhaps I can jump in just to say that we are running a bit late. So I also take what Federico was saying as a way to bring the different interventions together, and perhaps we can bring the event to a close now, since some of our panelists have to go. It would be nice to just conclude. And I don't know if Federico wanted to conclude, and Carolina just say a couple of words about the next steps of the project.
No, I think that's pretty much a synthetic comment. I think you know, if the speakers want to say maybe something about it, make a sort of final comment, and then I think we can wrap up.
Most of the speakers have to go, so I think that what we can do is either Carolina, do you want to say a couple of words?
Yes, I think so. And thank you, Federico, for bringing all these different elements together, because this is, as we said, this is just the beginning of this conversation. And so this is a continuum, let's say, of activities that we are also organizing around these particular issues, around this thinking of sociability and forms of life during and post pandemic. So finally, for me, I would like to thank all the guest speakers who joined today for your fantastic contributions, thought-provoking as well, and a lot of thoughts for us to continue entertaining as things evolve. So Martina, Miguel, Chiara, and Maurice, thank you so much for your contributions. I would like also to thank Kausar Hussein for helping us organize the event and for the flawless tech support. I just wanted to add before we all leave that this is the first event in a series of initiatives exploring our understandings of life in the post-pandemic. LifeFutures project includes also 4 artistic commissions with 4 practitioners, Melisandre Varin, the Post-Colonialism Artistic Collective, Hannah Honeywell, and Patricia Dominguez. Their contributions will be published between July and September on the Biopolitics and Democracy website, to be launched soon. You'll find also more updates on talks and this community definitions on the Biopolitics and Democracy Twitter account, which I share at the beginning of the event. So for me, really, thank you all. And for those who joined us today, have a lovely evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.